Welcome to the Mental Advantage Podcast. Whether you're an athlete trying to perform at your best when it counts the most, a coach or business leader trying to get more out of your team, or someone looking for more personal growth, this is the place for you. This podcast is your map to guide you to the right mindset, systems, and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. And now, here's John Cullen and Brandon Allen.
So as expected, I've been hearing a lot of really interesting feedback from Coach Meg's appearance on the podcast last week. Well, I guess it was earlier this week. Everybody really enjoyed that episode, really got a lot out of it. I think they liked the unpacking of dogs and what that meant and just how she's keeping something really, in a way, simple alive and well, within that program and how it's made such a big difference for them as they go into the season.
No doubt. And I think too, John, I mean, you and I know because we know some of the folks that are in this profession, and it is a heavily populated female profession for sure. But I think it's good to hear too, just a different voice and a different side of things that Coach Meg brought, and like the application stuff that she's doing is awesome.
Yeah, so we've continue, guys. If you are listening, if you've not heard that episode yet, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to it. And then also, as we've asked before, as you listen to these, if there is something you like, share those episodes with your friends, with anybody that you feel would benefit from listening to our podcast, because that's going to really help to get the word out and get everybody more dialed into what's going on here. Because as we've talked about before, we have had a really good run of guests, and I think each one of them brings something unique to the table. And tonight's no different. Adam Carter is going to talk to us from that mental performance side, but also he's got that behavior analyst side of things that brings a different perspective to it, because he really is going to share with the audience how he takes it maybe a step deeper.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, he's able to not only provide that foundation and that mental performance, but also maybe help that athlete not only understand their why, but why they have that why, which is really interesting, and I can't wait for the audience to hear it.
Sounds good. Well, as always, if you have any feedback on the show, listen to the email at the end of the show. It's podcast@mentaladvantage.net. And then, of course, rate and review the podcast on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, all of the different platforms that you can listen to podcasts. And stay tuned for Adam Carter. Welcome to the show, Adam Carter. So for the listeners, Adam is the host of his own podcast, Inside the Mind Podcast. He has over 100 episodes. He also works at Consistent Elite Performance as a Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and he's a mental performance coach, a little bit of everything. And I can't wait to unpack this with you, because that behavior analyst piece is really intriguing to me. I'm definitely going to be asking you some questions about that. But has a focus on the interaction between mind and body, and has done all kinds of cool things like research eliminating anxiety-based behaviors in children during fearful situations. And our first guest, to my knowledge, that actually has an article published. He's got a research article in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So, Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. I'm thrilled to be on, and can't wait for our discussion.
Absolutely. Well, we're happy to have you with us. So first of all, why don't we start here? Why don't we just start with your journey growing up in Canada? Like, tell us about some of that and maybe what got you so interested in the mental side of things.
Yeah, I mean, not to sound too cliche, but hockey was definitely my sport of choice growing up, and that's probably where the whole mental side of it started to come into play. Just growing up really kind of being scared of taking that next step in terms of I've always wanted to be a goalie growing up, but never could take that step to face a puck. Or I was always scared of body checking and taking the body when playing hockey and tried to shy away from it. And then I don't think it was until later on in my life, looking back on it, that I realized how much of a barrier the mental side of things was, even at such a young age for me. So really, going into university, sports psychology was always my end path. So I ended up getting my undergraduate degree in psychology. And then I kind of, in university, I had a co-op placement at a behavioral therapy clinic in Toronto, where they work with a lot of kids with autism, and kind of really fell in love with that gig. So I ended up pursuing that for my master's. That's where I got my master's in applied behavior analysis. But then researching a lot of that, I found out that a lot of the things that I learned in school really blended in with sports psychology. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy, things like acceptance and commitment therapy are all based around behaviors and changing someone's behaviors. So it kind of seemed at that point a natural fit to blend my education and to blend my passion for sports into pursuing a career as a performance coach, and also my hobby as a podcast host.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was kind of leading into my question. What are the things that you've really found that being a behavior analyst that have helped you the most with being a mental performance coach?
For sure. So as a behavior analyst, or the science of applied behavior analysis, they really focus on the functions of behavior and why people do what they do. And they generally kind of have 4 buckets for the functions of behavior. So somebody will have a behavior because they're trying to escape something. So it's kind of like an athlete. They may play timid on the ice because the rejection they get from somebody, or the bad play that they could make is so punishing for them that they're trying to escape that feeling. So that's kind of like one function. Or people might do things for the attention of somebody else. So if you think of an athlete that goes out to the club, does a lot of bad press and everything like that, they might crave that attention. So that could be a second function of behavior. Third function of behavior that they talk about is doing something for tangible reward. So you can think that, how many athletes unfortunately do something that might be detrimental to their health or detrimental to their public presence for money, for fame, whatever it may be. And the fourth function is for, they call it automatic reinforcement, but they like the sensations of that certain behavior. And just a non-sporting example would be like taking a Tylenol to relieve pain. So I guess painkillers could also be kind of a sport blend into it. So really those 4 functions of behavior: attention, tangible rewards, escape from something they don't want, and that sensation or that internal feeling. And it's really given me, I think, a unique lens to look at athletes' behaviors, one of those 4 buckets. And then it's given me, I think, a leg up on identifying the replacement behaviors for those behaviors they want to change. So if I know an athlete is doing something on the ice, on the pitch, on the field to escape something, I can then work with them to identify the behaviors that they need to do that will replace that function. Or if I know an athlete is doing something for a tangible reward or for someone's attention, we then work around that replacement behavior for that. So a bit of a off the cusp or but outside the box, I guess the word I was thinking of, view of it. But I think it's quite a unique view, and I've noticed a lot of athletes really kind of take towards that view as well.
That is really interesting and provides insight that I don't know that a lot of other mental performance coaches, where you can actually identify the reason. I know just in my own experience going through various therapies and talking with mental professionals, there a lot of times there's denial and things like that play a role. Do you find, because of having that background where you can get really, really granular with an athlete, do you find it more difficult at times because you can kind of see through that facade that they have?
I think so, because I think a lot of athletes, they don't realize maybe what they're doing. And sometimes I think it's my job for them they may have a certain perception of what their behaviors are leading to in their personal or professional career. And oftentimes when we go through an assessment, or I just ask them the type of open-ended questions where I can get the answers that I need, we can kind of walk towards a path where perhaps they thought that they were doing something because they got that good tangible reward, or because they thought they were getting that good attention from somebody. But it may be the case that they're actually as being masked by them actually wanting to escape something. So really getting the nitty-gritty details of that. Unfortunately, denial is sometimes a part of it, but I think that's part of my job, to help the athletes face their true inner functions of their behaviors.
So I think this is so interesting, Adam, because as you all are talking there, I was thinking about the why people do what they do. And you think about some of those common pain points among the athletes we work with, whether that be fear of failure, whether it's confidence, whether it's, not being able to handle pressure and getting anxious. A lot of times we're, to Brandon's point, addressing that at a surface level. But what I really like about what you're doing is you're finding out first at a deeper, granular level as far as what is it that's causing the fear of failure? What is it that's causing that, inability to handle pressure? Because as mental performance coaches, we can give them the systems and strategies that it takes to get beyond that. But I think you're almost kind of taking it to that next step, which is, hey, let's deal. Do you go to that level and deal with that first, and maybe try to unpack some of that before you even go and provide some of those systems and strategies?
For sure. I always try and figure out what the function of the behavior is first before I give that replacement behavior or that strategy, that mental strategy that I think will be most helpful. And also it kind of helps me as well, because a big part of applied behavior analysis and just my own personal practice is the use of data and graphs to track progress. So then I'll track with the athlete. We have our behavior we identified that we want to get rid of, and we have our replacement behavior that we identified that we want to increase. So let's actually, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, biweekly, track each of them. And then we can see over time that this behavior that was such an issue is actually decreasing over time, and the behavior that we want to replace is actually increasing over time. And of course, those behaviors would change based on the athlete, based on the function of the behavior. But more generally, it really allows us to plot everything on a graph and have that kind of that tangible progress that we can see.
I find that to be extremely interesting as well, from the standpoint that, we know that data doesn't really lie, right? It takes the emotion out of it. I think too, what's as I'm listening to you, Adam, describe this, one of the things that we have to do as athletes and as human beings in general is be honest with ourselves, right? I mean, look, if I'm playing football and that guy in front of me keeps whipping me, like, I have to be honest and go, man, you're getting beat. Like, you've got to make an adjustment. What I find to be really interesting about how deep you can go, not only are you telling them to be honest with themselves, but you're showing them why, which as an athlete, we all like to be truly coached, like you should. And you're not just giving them the playbook. You're really kind of digging deep in there. That is a really interesting background that you have, Adam. It's really cool stuff.
So, Adam,
go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask you, so to that end, what is the awareness level like, with a lot of these athletes? Because that's one of the things that as a mental performance coach, I find I'm always trying to improve is the person's awareness of it. So if you're going to go to that next step, I would imagine that that's one of the things that you are probably identifying as what I call blind spots more than anything. They're just not aware that they have this issue. Like they just know that, I freeze when the game gets really big, or I lack confidence, but it's probably that first step, I would imagine, for you is really just even making them aware of something that they're probably not even aware of.
Exactly. You couldn't put it any better. And especially because I feel like the field of applied behavior analysis, I mean, it's rooted in psychology, but I don't think it's a very well-known science. It's a very small field. It's a very niche field because if you go on jobs, people that are board certified behavior analysts, I mean, 95% of jobs are for people that work with kids with autism and that behavioral therapy component. So it's not well known to the general public, but as difficult as it is sometimes, I'm still improving on it, but trying to communicate the science in words that everybody can understand, especially athletes that are, 10, 11 or 12 years old. It's a very high order thinking that it's sometimes a struggle for them to understand what I'm saying, but really trying to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but make it in a language that they're able to understand. It takes a couple sessions sometimes, and sometimes I'll even go above and beyond what our allocated session time is. But I think it's such a valuable component to athletes to know not only what they're doing, but why they're doing it. Because it then, again, just makes that whole replacement behavior piece that much easier to identify, that much more buy-in from the kid and his family or her family. But it's definitely a cool experience to see that aha moment go off in a child's face.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to Brandon a couple of weeks ago about this, but there's an old business book called The Oz Principle, and it's a book about accountability. And in this book, they outline 4 steps: see it, own it, solve it, and do it. So oftentimes, I think probably as coaches, I know as mental performance coaches, we do this, but we have a tendency to go from the see it to the solve it. And then we want to go right to the do it. And I imagine that there's a level of frustration for some of these players if we skip that own it step. And like you're saying there is if that awareness isn't there and we go right into that solve it thing, I'm wondering if it's not a situation, quite honestly, and I just was thinking about this as you were talking, that we're just putting a Band-Aid on something. We're not actually fixing the issue because we're just giving them techniques that are going to get them able to maybe do this, but for the short term, because until we address some of those underlying issues, we might not be able to really, until they own it, so to speak, we might not be able to fix that in the long term.
I think that's so important too, because the things that you and I or Brandon would help an athlete with don't only pertain to their sport, it pertains to their life in general. An athlete that lacks confidence on the ice or on the pitch or on the football field may lack confidence in some other area of their life, and there might be a real strong relationship between those two settings. So if you really get to the underlying why for lack of confidence in a sport, you may inevitably be helping the athlete just in their life in general, and just confidence in school, confidence in their relationships, confidence in their friendships.
How receptive are the athletes that you're working with, hockey players, the different sports that you're running into mostly in Canada? How receptive are they to that mental side of things? Because I know we're just now in the United States starting to see more and more as this is becoming more of a, oh, you know what? This sport is 90% mental. I do need to focus more attention on that. And you're starting to see more mental performance coaches with different schools and athletic programs and organizations, and then even to the business side of things, just from a performance standpoint. But is that gaining traction in Canada? Like, where are you as far as that goes?
I think definitely. I think probably about a year ago, there were a couple of stories that came out of the NHL about improper coaching techniques, and it just kind of lent itself to the discussion of just the mental side of the game. And I think also Bell Let's Talk has a beautiful campaign that they do every February. So Bell, for people that aren't familiar, is like a cell phone company in Canada. And they do the Bell Let's Talk campaign where for every tweet or every hashtag, they donate 5 cents to mental health research. And a lot of like guys in the Raptors, the Blue Jays, all the NHL teams, all the Canadian international athletes, they all get behind that. Wow. So I felt really in the last 5 years or so, there's been an explosion of people just being aware of the mental side of the game, being aware of mental health. And I really think that Bell Let's Talk campaign has really been that springboard for it. So when an athlete comes to me and as part of consistent elite performance, generally they already have 100% buy-in, and like they're so motivated to work on the mental game. They have that recognition already. that the mental game is really 90% of it.
Yeah. Have you read the book, The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
I have not, no.
So there's an interesting thing that I want you to, we're so far off the list of questions I had for you, by the way, but I mean, that's a really good thing because
that's a good thing. Yeah.
Because that means that we're really diving into something here. But in the book, The Outliers, they talk about in Canada, if you look at most NHL players, now I don't know if this is still the same way, but this has been probably 10 years ago since this book came out. But if you look at it, most birthdays are from January through March of people who play in the NHL, simply because there is a great gap between I should say a great benefit you get by being an older, early birthday. So if you turn a certain age, your body's more developed at a young age. So you're going to get more access to the premier coaching, the junior leagues, like all of the things that you're able to the benefits, like in our, like what we're seeing now is like travel leagues and things like that pop up. But you get that elite level coaching. But it was a really interesting thing that I'm thinking about now as you're talking about this, about those hockey players, is I wonder how much of it comes down to the fact that if I'm not getting some of that next level coaching at an early age in Canada, how much that might create a fixed mindset for me as a hockey player, for example, because I think, you know what, I'm just not good enough. I'm just not as good as some of those other players. And that at a young age, they can't make that connection. Like, you know what, that's because those players got the benefit of a lot of additional training because they were just older and bigger and stronger than still somebody who was born in the same year as me, but they were just born earlier in the year. Does that make sense? It
does. No, 100%. Yeah. I know a lot of people, either personally or just professionally, that they aim to have their kids between January and March or January and April.
Amazing.
To get kind of ahead of the curve, like you said. It's just, hockey is a tough sport to make it in Canada, I think, especially. And primarily the kids that I deal with are hockey players, and just the amount of kids that play AA or AAA and,
right,
they just break down in front of me, either them or a member of their family, just because of all the pressure they're feeling. And especially when they're getting to that 15 or 16 year mark where it really is make it or break it. You either make it to one of the junior leagues in Canada or you're playing junior B or junior C. And then it's really, really tough to kind of have any career from it.
Well, and we see it here in the States a lot with reclassing. I mean, at least I know. So I'm in Georgia, and you see kids reclassing all the time. My son is in 7th grade, and we played last year, or I guess it was last season, with an 8th grade group of kids, and we even saw it on teams that we played. They took advantage of COVID and that kids were being homeschooled. And so you could tell that there were 16-year-old kids out there playing 8th grade football, maybe 15. But these were big kids that were going to take advantage of being able to reclass. And to your point, John, even a lot of teachers and professionals are saying, hey, I'd much rather deal with a 19 or 20-year-old freshman in college than a 17 or 18-year-old, just from the decision-making capabilities, right? Just the mental and emotional maturity. It's crazy how that can be an absolute game changer for kids. And I'm hoping that stuff that like you're doing, Adam, as it works its way down to the younger kids, right? And the stuff that we're trying to teach, that maybe you can still be a younger athlete and have some mental performance, foundation. But it's really interesting the advantages people try to take as you progress.
And I think to a point, I think it's at some point it's sad because I don't think the kids, their prefrontal cortex and their brain isn't as developed as, as it can be. So are they really that cognizant or aware of like what's actually going on here? I think a lot of the onus then comes on the parent, because I mean, we could argue whether it's within the rules or not, but morally, is it right to have your kid do that and be at such an advantage and taking advantage of the rules, where they just dominates. And I think that parent, I mean, I understand putting your kid in the best position to succeed, but there's also the flip side of the equation where how many kids lose their opportunity because of parents taking advantage of these reclassification rules or just different rules that have come up because of COVID.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that that's where it really is dependent on the parents and ourselves as coaches to focus on the opportunity to teach about response, because at the end of the day, we can't control whether or not those kids get reclassed or whether or not they are taking advantage of some of the rules. So I think it's one of those things that somewhere in there, in that challenge, in that adversity, if you will, there's an opportunity to teach the ability to respond, and that, you know what, you can still go out there and do the best you can. You can still control what you can control and hope that it happens. But I think to your point, you know, it's still worth an explanation, because I think if you don't explain that to them, I could easily see where there's a level of frustration that could develop into something later on down the road, like a lack of confidence. So hockey is one of those sports, Adam, that I kind of look at basketball, hockey, soccer, some of these sports that are they're constantly flowing, right? So what are some of the challenges with some of those hockey players as it relates, because there's not a lot of breaks in the action. So it's not like you can say, you know, in baseball, which is what I predominantly deal with, baseball and softball, you know, where you can talk about taking that moment to be aware of your control, commit to the plan, compete, you know, the 3 C's that Ken Revisit taught us in Heads Up Baseball. But what are some of the things you find you're most of the time working with hockey players on? For example, breathing, I would imagine, would be one of those things, but those things are getting them back present.
For sure. We call it a consistently performance, just like the reset routine. And I think that's where we always start off with our hockey athletes, because like you said, it's such a fast paced game. The shifts are only about a minute or so each, minute 15, 45 seconds, maybe somewhere in that range. And then you're on the bench for 2 to 3 minutes, and then you're back out there again. It's very back and forth. So we teach them that reset routine, and how do they, when they're sitting on the bench waiting for that 2 or 3 minutes for their next shift, how do they take that breath to calm themselves? How do they reflect on what just happened? And how do they have that mindset, or at least that self-talk, so that when they go out for their next shift, they still have the same amount of confidence like they had, like nothing bad had happened. And it's about teaching them to do that within 15 to 30 seconds, because hockey, like you said, is such a fast-paced game that if you stall it or you take too long with your mental strategies when you're on the bench, before you know it, you're back on the ice and you're even more behind the 8 ball than you were. Yeah.
I would imagine the other thing, and not to get too deep in just to that one lane, because I know you deal with a lot more athletes than just hockey, but the other thing I was thinking about that I see as an observer watching the NHL is goalies. Like, you see these goalies that if they give up a goal, it always ends up becoming like one of those nights where it's like 3 or 4, you know what I mean? Like, it just, it can really quickly snowball for a goalie, because I think it becomes that not staying in the present moment. It's looking back on what happened. You know, that was a big play I just gave up, especially in playoff hockey, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think to some degree it's still the reset routine, but it's a bit different, because when a goalie lets in a goal, for example, there's that 2 or 3 minutes where they have to watch the team celebrate and they have to hear the other fans cheer. So it's really hard to get your mind back on track when all that's going on around you, compared to a player where they might have a bad shift, make a bad play, but the team doesn't necessarily score because of that mistake. So when they're on the bench, there's less going on around them. Goalies is such an interesting position, especially in hockey. And I see it so many times. They show the goalies on national TV, and they have their like pregame routines and their visualization routines, and it's like one of the more, I think, under realized mental positions in sport.
I totally agree with that.
Absolutely. But you can also see it on the flip side too, right? So a guy's standing on his head and he's like, hey, you can just keep peppering me. I'm a wall back here, right? I mean, momentum plays such on both sides of it, plays such a huge role in the mental performance game.
For sure.
Yeah. So what was it that got you into thinking, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast? What was that thought process?
It was probably Gary Vaynerchuk, who, I don't know if you guys
Yeah, absolutely. Gary V.
He is the one that inspired me to start a podcast, just about following your passion and just taking advantage of social media and just putting yourself out there, and you never know what can happen. I mean, I think the only reason why I have my gig at Consistently Performance was because of my podcast, because before that, all I did was work at a children's hospital as a behavior therapist for kids with autism. Like, there was no prior experience working with athletes. It wasn't really until I started my podcast, I started putting out content about sports psychology and about the mental side of things, is where I feel like I really started to learn, and then the opportunity came up. So I guess, yeah, just listening to Gary V, taking advantage of the tools around me, and just getting over that fear of failure of a podcast going horribly, which I have had some that have, but it's about the ones that are good. That's why I keep going.
Yeah, it's really an interesting thing. I've never heard that somebody actually used the podcast to get into the mental performance side, or at least some of the things you're doing there, with consistent elite performance. So that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah.
So I do have a question. So Adam, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, because my thought process behind that was because I had no prior experience in sports psychology. All I had was almost like indirect experience and indirect knowledge, but no like actual work experience. So I kind of thought to myself, like, how do I, at such a, I don't want to say old age, but I was probably 26 at the time, how do I break into the field without actually having a master's in sports psychology? Because like I mentioned, I know how to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm aware of acceptance and commitment therapy. I think there's a lot of overlap. I just don't have like the quote unquote like credential. That's where the podcast kind of came into play.
It gave you some clout, right? So right. I do. So as a mental professional, can you sense pretty early? I mean, because this is what, John, our 10th podcast. So
yeah, Adam's double digits, number 10.
Big up to you, Adam. But can you tell, because you've got some great guests? I mean, you've got players from every professional league out there, but can you feel it kind of getting off the rails? And do you try to, from a mental perspective, do you go, oh boy, this is not going well, and how do I reel it back in, or do you just kind of let it take you?
I'm definitely my hardest critic when it comes to putting a podcast episode out. And it's interesting because I felt like the podcast episodes that have gone the worst for me are the ones where I get the best feedback about. So I just think I just get so hard on myself, and I think it's just a continuing process. I mean, it's kind of ironic that I struggle so much with the mental side of podcasting, and I help athletes out with their mental side of their right. game. But especially earlier on, I had strived for every episode to be perfect. And it wasn't until I just took that attitude of whether I think this podcast episode is perfect or whether I think it's a failure, it's still me, and it's authentically who I am and what me and the athlete talked about. So let me just put it out there and just see what happens, because the worst that can happen is nobody listens to it and I just do another one, because I usually have a couple lined up. So I was like, whatever, I'll just upload another one next week and see how that one goes. So over time, I've been less harsh on myself, but definitely that mental piece is putting yourself out there is no easy task, I think, for anyone.
Agreed. And I think too, the great part about podcasting and the similarity, the parallel to playing a sport is, hey, if you make a mistake, then, next one up, like I get to do it again. And you learn. And John and I have talked about it before, the whole thing of perfection being the enemy of progress. they're not all going to be perfect, but there's probably not one that you've had that you don't at least have an opportunity to learn something from. So
exactly. I did episode not too long ago with Joseph Odom, who's now catcher is part of the Rays organization, but he played for the Mariners last year. And I put out a piece of content from that talked about how perfection is paralyzing. And even to the further point, like my perception of perfection is different from your perception of perfection, which is different than John's perception of perfection. So then it begs the question, what actually is perfection? I think perfection is just loving what you do and having fun with it. So that's kind of been my slow mental progression through these, I think 103, 104 episodes now. So yeah.
So do you find yourself, Adam, when you're having these conversations, because you consistently do something that we are just now going to start getting into, which is interviewing more athletes and getting more coaches and those types of on the show. Do you find yourself, as you're having those conversations, do you look for people who already have a grip on it, or do you look for people who you just want to talk about what their routines are, what their process is, and then maybe along the way, you might even be sharing something with them about something that might help them?
Yeah, I want to say earlier on, it was more so just about getting to know somebody and not too much focusing on like their social media presence and if they actually put out content in terms of the mental game. But I want to say probably the last 6 months or so, I've really kind of honed in on who I try and recruit to come on the show, of people that have already put out those pieces of content or have shown that passion or that recognition of the mental side of the game. I think that it just lends itself to a more valuable conversation for a lot of my audience and a lot of their audience as well.
So I love asking this question. I say that like, this is episode 104, like you have. So in the 10 episodes we've done, I probably asked this question 3 or 4 times. So as you work with athletes or clients or just guests on your show, what have you noticed, or like when's the last time somebody said something that made you think differently about mental performance in general?
That's a good question. I want to say it wasn't necessarily like it was new, but just the way that he worded it was really interesting and allowed me to apply it to even just my podcasting, which is kind of weird. But I had, I think it was episode 76. I had Curtis Gabriel. He plays in NHL. Right now he's on the San Jose Sharks. Had a couple of good fights last week too that I recommend anyone checking out. But he was really into the mental side of things and really about just following your passion, following just what you want to do, and that you just have one life on this earth and just live it to your fullest potential and all that stuff. And it really clicked with me because I went into the interview wanting to talk to him about the mental side of hockey, but it's quickly transitioned to just the mental side of life. And we talked about all the different passions that he has, that he goes through, and all the different passions that I have and I go through. And it really helped me, I think, in my professional career as a mental coach, talk to athletes about the importance of taking time away from their sport, as counterproductive as that may seem to them, because they want to get as best as they can at their sport, and they think that the more time they put in, the better they get, which is true to an extent. Just like your physical body, your mental mind needs a rest as well. So let's actually identify these passions and these hobbies that we can integrate into your daily life and your daily routine, so that it gives your brain a chance to recharge, so that when you want to work on visualization or when you want to work on your reset routine, that we can do so with 100% capacity for your mental side.
Yeah, it's what gets scheduled gets done.
Yeah.
So I've got a maybe an little off-topic question. The enforcer in the NHL is starting to kind of go away, right? I mean, they still have it, but not to you talk about having a couple of fights, but not to the extent that it used to. Do you see a different mindset with enforcers in the NHL, or do you deal with any of them? Those are big guys that are of everybody there, team first. Like, I'm going to take care of everybody, and I'm going to sacrifice myself more than maybe almost anybody on the team. Right.
Right. I haven't worked with any specifically, but speaking to Curtis, it was really eye-opening because he talked about how he kind of takes a dual approach where he's continually evolving his game, but he's also not going to get away from what got him to where he is.
Mm-hmm.
So he's about the same age as me, I think. He's probably about 27 or 28. And when he was 17 to 21, 22, just breaking into the league, he was that fighter, that enforcer, that, you know, that rock'em sock'em robot kind of guy.
Right.
And now that the league's evolved in the past 5 or 6 years, he talked about changing his game and working on things that would allow him to stay afloat in the league, but also not straying away from who he is as a person and who and just the style of play that he likes to play. And I think it's just it kind of had me thinking there, just how challenging I think that is for a lot of NHLers, because even though it might not seem like this to them, but if they still play their game, that's where they're going to get the most success. Even though the enforcer is kind of out of the league, as they say, I think there's still an enforcer light role that could be played.
Absolutely.
So what's next for you, Adam? Where are you wanting to evolve the podcast? What's kind of the next thing that you know, Gary Vee inspired you to take this step that ultimately led to another step. What's the next thing that you'd like to accomplish?
When I first started my podcast, I really wanted it to be a source of income. But as I got more and more into it, I realized that I just loved doing the podcast. And no matter if my podcast had 10 views or 500 views, I still enjoy making the podcast just as much. So I've kind of changed my perception of the podcast as just a hobby, and whatever comes from it. Just consistently doing one episode a week. And I feel like that kind of fits my schedule well. But more specifically for the months ahead, I'm trying to really focus on just putting out more content in terms of the mental side of sports and the mental side of life, and just trying to reach more people that way. But still with just the mindset of this is just what I like to do, not in it for like this is going to be my job, not in it for I want to make a career out of this per se, but just I love talking about the mental side of sports. I love creating content. I love helping athletes. If I make some money on the side, that's great. But just continuing to just follow my passion, and I feel like that's just where I'm the most productive and the most happy.
I love, and this is probably going to be the title of this particular show, but I love that idea of the mental side of life, because I think oftentimes we struggle with this thought that, you know, during this podcast, it always kind of goes back to athletics. It always kind of goes back to the, you know, athletes we work with and mental performance. But the reality of it is, we hoped when we started it that the systems and strategies that we talk about consistently, people started to make that connection that this can help me in life in general. It's going to help me be a better father or mother, husband or wife. It's going to help me be a better business person, employee, whatever the case may be. The idea that if I have the right mindset and I put a good strategy and a good plan together, and I attack that with a certain level of discipline every single day, I'm ultimately going to become a better version of myself. So I think oftentimes, even though we maybe get in, I know I get in my own head about this, where I start thinking, maybe we're focused too much on the athletic side of things. I think hopefully we're giving people enough ammunition to go out there and attack life that way.
Exactly, because we can't play sports 24 hours of the day, and we can't play sports, for our whole entire life. There does come a point in time, whether it's in your day, your week, your month, or just your entire life, where sports takes a back seat. And now it's, I think, the job of the individual to take the principles they've applied in hockey, in football, in baseball, whatever it is, and apply it to other aspects of life. Which is why I always encourage parents to just enroll their kids in as many sports as they can, or in as many sports as their kids want to play at such a young age. Because I think there are certain lessons that kids learn that they can only learn in sports, or maybe that are best learned in sports.
Absolutely.
Teamwork, leadership, dealing with failure, those things. Just the value of sports and the value of it all.
For sure. Well, Adam, listen, we certainly appreciate you taking some time. We've been, followers of your content, listen to your show. As Brandon pointed out, some of the guests you've had on there makes for some very interesting conversations. And I know it's busy time for you. And so we really appreciate you taking the time. I know that on Instagram, people can follow you at Adam O.R. Carter. It's ADAMORCARTER. Any other places people might be able to check in and see your content?
I put all my episodes up on YouTube, which is just under Adam Carter. But if they search Inside the Mind podcast, they'll also find it there. And yeah, that's kind of my two main places right now. I'm trying to put out just a lot of valuable content on Instagram from the content that I put out on YouTube, so they kind of blend in each other.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely be following you, and thank you for joining us tonight on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, guys. I had a lot of fun.
Want to provide feedback or stay up to date with the show? Visit our Instagram page at Mental Advantage Podcast, or you can send us an email at podcast@mentaladvantage.net. To have John Cullen work with you or your team, please write to him at john.cullen@mentaladvantage.net. Thanks for listening to today's episode.